"You are the only remaining family," the lawyer had said, handing me a worn brass key to my grandmother Elsa's mountain cabin. He used the word estate, but people always said she was poor, a fact I believed during the 2 years my 9-year-old daughter Wren and I spent sleeping on shelter cots, wondering why Elsa never reached out. But as I pried open the hidden cellar trap door beneath her garden shed, my flashlight illuminated not a dusty void, but an immaculate, climate-controlled vault. Inside were 2 decades of preserved food, heritage seeds, and a financial envelope proving her worthless land was shielding a massive conservation trust fund. She hadn't abandoned us. She had spent 20 years silently building an impenetrable fortress to save us. Not on a keychain, not hanging from a hook by the door, like most people kept house keys. Around her neck, always, as if losing, it would mean losing something irreplaceable. The lawyer had handed it to her 3 days ago, across a laminate desk in a small office that smelled of old paper and recycled air. He had used the word estate in a tone that almost made Mara want to laugh, because the word implied grandeur, and Grandma Elsa had never owned anything grand, just the house up the mountain, just the land around it, just whatever was inside. "You are the only remaining family," the lawyer had said, and Mara had nodded as though she already knew this, even though the full weight of it, only remaining, had not yet settled into her bones. She was 37 years old. She had $17 in a bank account she had not checked in 2 weeks. Her daughter, Wren, was 9 and had been sleeping on a fold-out cot in a shelter since October. It was now the first week of March. The mountain was still half covered in old snow, and the key was smaller than she remembered. The path to the house was not paved in any official sense. It was a rutted dirt lane that wound upward through Douglas firs, so tall they made the sky feel like something borrowed rather than given. Mara had not driven this road in nearly 20 years. The last time she had been 19, furious about something she could no longer name, and she had left without saying a proper goodbye to Elsa. That was the memory that had sat heaviest in her chest since the phone call 2 weeks ago. Not grief exactly, but something older and less clean. Wren walked beside her without asking many questions. This was something Mara had noticed about her daughter in recent months. She had learned to read silences. Children in shelters learned this quickly. They watched adults for signs, catalogued the small shifts in expression, adjusted their energy accordingly. Wren was good at it now in a way that made Mara's heart ache every time she noticed it. "Is it far?" Wren asked. "Not far," Mara said. The borrowed truck she had driven up the mountain road was parked where the lane narrowed too much to continue safely. She carried a duffel bag on one shoulder, their only bag packed with enough for a week. She didn't know yet if they would stay longer. She didn't know what they would find. She had told herself on the drive up from the city that she was not expecting anything, that whatever Grandma Elsa had left would simply be what it was, a house that probably needed work, land that was difficult to sell in winter, perhaps some furniture, some dishes, a pile of things that would need to be sorted and donated. She had told herself these things quietly, practically, because hope had become something she managed carefully now, like a candle in wind. But her hands had not been entirely steady when she picked up the key. The trees thinned slightly as they climbed, and then Mara saw it. The roofline first, dark green metal that had been there so long it had begun to rust along one edge, and then the porch, and then the whole shape of the house emerging from the hillside as if the mountain had simply grown it there. The way it grew ferns and moss and silence. It was smaller than she remembered, too. Most things were. But there was something else she noticed immediately, something that caught her off guard enough that she stopped walking for a moment. The garden beside the house, a long rectangle of raised earth alongside the south-facing wall, was not the overgrown tangle she had expected. The beds had been edged recently, within the last season at least. Dark soil, well turned. Straw mulch laid carefully over whatever lay dormant underneath. Someone had tended it. Elsa had died in late November. The lawyer had mentioned she had a neighbor who checked on the property, an elderly man named Carl, who lived a mile and a half down the road and had known Elsa for 40 years. Perhaps it had been him. Mara stood and looked at the garden for a long moment. "Mom," Wren said softly, "you okay?" "Yeah," Mara said. "Yeah, I'm okay." She moved toward the porch steps, and something in her chest moved too. Not quite grief, not quite longing, but something between them that had no clean name. She had grown up being told that Grandma Elsa was a poor woman. Everyone said it without cruelty, simply as a fact of geography and circumstance. A widow since Mara's mother was small, a woman who had lived simply in a mountain house on land that wasn't worth much, who made her own soap and put up her own preserves and wore the same boots for 11 winters running. Poor, everyone said. Mara fit the key into the lock and turned it. The door opened on the first try. The smell came first. Wood smoke and dried herbs and something underneath both of those things, older and earthier, like the smell of the mountain itself had seeped into the plaster over a century and decided to stay. Mara breathed it in, standing in the doorway, and something in her chest that had been tight for months loosened very slightly, like a thread given a small amount of slack. Wren stepped inside first, her eyes going wit and quiet at once, the way children's eyes do when they enter a space that feels unlike ordinary spaces. The main room was exactly as Mara remembered it, almost exactly. The wood stove in the corner with its blackened pipe running up through the ceiling. The 2 windows with their deep sills where Elsa used to set seedling pots in early spring. The table in the center, heavy oak, scarred with use over what must have been decades. And the shelves everywhere. The shelves floor to ceiling on 2 walls, crowded not with books, but with jars. Hundreds of jars, amber and clear, and the dark green-black of preserved greens, labeled in Elsa's handwriting, which was small and careful and slightly tilted to the left, the way left-handed people learn to write when forced to use their right in school. Mara walked to the shelves slowly, and read the labels the way you might read something sacred. Tomato 2022, apple butter 2021, garlic in oil 2023, pickled beans, bone broth, wild plum jam. The dates went back further than she expected. She found a jar from 2009, another from 2006. Grandma made all of these? Wren asked. Yes, Mara said, and she meant to say it simply, but something about the sheer accumulation of them, years of summers distilled into glass, sealed with wax and patience, and the slow work of hands, made her voice come out differently than intended. She moved through the room and into the kitchen, which was a narrow, efficient space that showed the logic of a woman who had cooked seriously her entire life. Cast iron pans hung in size order above the range. Cutting boards worn smooth at their centers. A collection of dried herbs bundled and hung from the low ceiling beams. Lavender, rosemary. Something she identified as yarrow from the feathery leaves. On the kitchen table, there was an envelope. It was addressed to no one. It simply said in Elsa's handwriting, "For when you come." Mara stood looking at it for longer than was probably reasonable. Something about those 4 words felt heavier than they should. For when you come. Not if, not a name, just the certainty of eventual arrival and the patience to wait for it. She picked it up and held it, but she did not open it yet. She wasn't sure why. Perhaps because she knew that once she read whatever was inside, something would shift, and she was not yet ready to let go of the particular texture of not knowing. She set the envelope back down and showed Wren the rest of the house instead. The 2 small bedrooms, each with a narrow bed and a wool blanket. The bathroom with its clawfoot tub that had always seemed impossibly grand to Mara as a child, in a house that was otherwise so plainly furnished, and the back porch which faced east and caught the morning light over the ridge in a way that Mara suddenly sharply remembered from childhood visits. She had forgotten she knew this place like this in her body, not just in memory. "I like it," Wren said from the back porch. She said it simply without the performance of enthusiasm that children sometimes produce for adults' benefit. She said it as a plain observation the way she might report the weather. "Me too," Mara said. She stood beside her daughter and looked out at the ridge where the snow was still thick between the trees, but the southern face of the slope was beginning to show dark earth in patches. March doing its slow, unglamorous work of returning things to warmth. She had not liked very many places in the past 2 years. The shelter had been kind, genuinely kind. The staff, good people with limited resources and too many people to help. But it was not a place you liked. It was a place you survived. Before that had been a series of temporary arrangements, a cousin's couch, a friend's spare room, each of which had its own quiet terms and expiration date. Before that had been the apartment she and Wren had lost when Mara's hours at the restaurant were cut, and then the restaurant itself closed, and then her savings, which had never been much, ran out faster than she had calculated. She did not think of those 2 years often in narrative terms. She simply lived them and moved through them carrying Wren, keeping things as stable as she could manage. But standing on this porch, she let herself feel the length of it for a moment. The weight of it. The envelope was waiting for her inside. Carl arrived the next morning. Mara heard boots on the porch steps while she was making coffee. She had found coffee in the kitchen cupboard, still sealed, along with a careful pantry that suggested someone had stocked it, not long before Elsa passed. She opened the door to find an old man with a face like weathered bark and eyes that were calm and intelligent beneath a worn cap. "You're Mara," he said, not as a question. "I am Carl Bergström. Your grandmother talked about you quite a bit." He paused. "I kept things going as best I could after she passed. The garden, mostly. She was particular about the garden." Mara invited him in. He sat at the oak table in the way of someone who had sat there many times before and accepted coffee with both hands around the mug. Wren emerged from the bedroom and regarded him with careful curiosity, and Carl regarded her in return with the same seriousness, which Mara noticed and appreciated. "She did the garden herself until about a year before she died," Carl said. "Then her niece wouldn't have it anymore. We arranged. She would tell me what to do, and I would do it. She had very specific ideas." "She always did," Mara said. Carl nodded slowly. "She talked about you coming. Said she hoped you'd find your way back eventually." He wrapped both hands more firmly around his mug. "She didn't know when. She just prepared, I suppose." That was Elsa. She always prepared. "For what?" Mara asked. Carl looked at her for a moment, then glanced toward the shelves visible through the kitchen doorway. "I imagine she'd want you to find that out for yourself." "There's an envelope. I found it," Mara said. "I haven't opened it yet." He nodded again as if this made sense to him. She also wanted me to show you the cellar, he said, when you were ready. Mara had not yet found the cellar. She had not known to look for one. She had the entrance moved some years back, Carl explained. It's in the garden shed now. Makes more practical sense from a storage perspective, she said. The corners of his eyes creased slightly, though I always thought she moved it because she didn't want people to stumble across it. What's in it? Things, Carl said simply, and then with the same unhurried tone, things she spent a very long time putting there. They went to the garden shed after coffee, a low, solid structure built against the north fence, its interior smelling richly of soil and engine oil and old wood. Carl moved aside a workbench that turned out to roll on heavy casters, deliberately fitted for the purpose, revealing a wooden trapdoor set into the shed floor with a simple iron ring for a handle. Mara pulled it open and looked down into darkness. A wooden ladder led down. Carl handed her a flashlight from a shed shelf, and she descended. The cellar was not large, perhaps 10 feet by 12. But in the beam of the flashlight, Mara saw that every wall was lined with shelving, and every shelf was full. More jars, yes, far more than the house held, organized with a system she could not immediately decipher, but which was clearly intentional. Boxes, canisters, sealed packets wrapped in wax paper and labeled. And on the far wall, a row of wooden crates, each one numbered. She stood in the middle of the cellar and turned slowly, the flashlight moving across surfaces, trying to understand the scale of what she was looking at. She was not yet sure what most of it was, but the size of the effort it represented, the years of accumulation, the care of organization was immediately, unmistakably clear. She climbed back up and looked at Carl in the thin morning light of the shed. "How long?" she asked. He considered. She started seriously around 2005. I'd say after your mother passed. He met her eyes steadily. Maybe before that. But that's when it became something she talked about with purpose. Mara did the math without meaning to. 20 years. She opened the envelope that evening after Wren was asleep. She sat at the oak table with the wood stove burning and a single lamp on, and she carefully unsealed the envelope. It had not been gummed shut, just folded closed, as if Elsa had known that anything sealed too tightly resisted the person it was meant for. Inside were 3 pages written in Elsa's small leftward tilting hand. Dear Mara, I don't know what kind of shape things are in for you right now. I hope they're fine. I hope you're reading this from somewhere comfortable, and this is just a strange artifact. A letter from an old woman that makes you smile a little and then get back to your life. But I've spent enough time in this world to know that life doesn't always cooperate with hope. So I tried to do what I could for, if it didn't. Let me start at the beginning because it matters. When your grandfather died, I had $43 in the bank and a house that needed a new roof. I had your mother who was 5 years old. I had 2 acres of good southern-facing slope that nobody wanted to buy because the access road was too narrow for the tractors that people imagined they'd need. I was told more than once that I was in a sorry situation. People said it kindly. They still said it. I decided something that winter. I decided that I was going to build the slowest possible safety net I'd ever heard of. Not for me. I was already past the age of being saved by safety nets for whoever came after me, for whoever needed it. I started with the garden, not for food right away. First, just to understand what this land would give. It turned out it would give quite a lot if you asked it the right way. By the time I understood the soil, I was preserving more than I could use. So I kept what I didn't need. I started with the cellar, as it was small, damp. Had Carl's son waterproof it in 1998. Started the proper shelving in 2000. Started the serious accumulation in 2005. What's down there, Mara? Is this 17 years of preserved food, carefully retated, so nothing is past its use? Enough to feed a small family for the better part of a year without supplementing. Seeds, heritage varieties, labeled and sealed against moisture. Enough to plant the garden many times over. 6 crates of canned goods I traded labor for with neighbors over the years. 2 crates of medical supplies, basic but considered. Everything Carl knows about what grows here and why. I had him write it down, and it's in the blue binder on the second shelf. And in the last crate, under everything else, is an envelope. Not a letter. The financial kind. I want to tell you about the land. It isn't worth what people told me. It wasn't worth. About 12 years ago, a man came to talk to me about a conservation easement. The land trust people, the ones who work with the county. I didn't sell the land. I signed an agreement with them that protects it from certain kinds of development, and in exchange I received a payment. I put it somewhere it would grow slowly and quietly, the way I grow things. I don't want you to have expectations I can't meet, so I'll just say it's more than it looks like at first. Not a fortune, but more than nothing, more than $43. I know I wasn't always easy to stay in contact with. I know the last time you came, there were hard things said, and then you were gone for a long time, and then life became what it became for both of us. I'm not writing this as a way of settling that. Some things don't get settled. They just get outlasted. But I thought about you. I thought about your mother. And then when she was gone, I thought about you. And then when I heard you had a daughter, I thought about her too, even though I never met her. Whatever you need this place to be, let it be that. I love you, Elsa. Mara read the letter twice. Then she sat with it in her hands for a long time, not reading it a third time, just holding it while the fire in the wood stove made its small, patient sounds, and the wind moved through the firs outside, and the mountain held its dark and enormous silence all around. She was not crying exactly. There was something happening in her chest that was too large and too laid to be simply crying. It felt like standing in a room you've walked through your entire life and finally looking up to see the ceiling. She spent the next 4 days going through the cellar. She did it systematically, the way Elsa would have wanted, she suspected. Carl came on the second day and helped her catalogue everything, working slowly, reading labels aloud, while Mara wrote them in a notebook she found in the kitchen drawer. Wren sat on a turned-over crate and listened, occasionally asking what things were, and Carl answered her with the patience of someone accustomed to answering questions, slowly and honestly. The scope of it accumulated gradually rather than hitting all at once. 243 jars of preserved food in cellar alone, organized by category and date, rotated so the oldest were at the front. Seeds and labeled paper packets and sealed glass tubes, tomatoes, squash, beans, greens, herbs stored at the cool, consistent temperature the cellar maintained naturally. The medical supplies were sensible and current. Bandages, antiseptic, basic medications, a first aid manual. Everything a person might need to manage ordinary illness or injury for an extended period. The blue binder was 46 pages of Carl's handwriting, instructions for the garden, soil compositions, planting schedules, what had worked and what hadn't over many years of trial, notes in the margins in Elsa's writing, small corrections and additions, the two of them in ongoing quiet dialogue across the page. She made me write it all down over about 2 years, Carl said, sitting on his turned-over crate reading a page. Said she needed someone else to carry it, in case her memory went. I thought she just meant in case she got sick. He paused. But she meant for after, didn't she? Yes, Mara said. On the 4th day, she moved the last crate, the one Elsa had mentioned, and found the financial envelope underneath, sealed with the more permanent kind of closure this time, a metal clip and a fold. Inside were documents, investment account statements, a letter from the County Land Trust, correspondence with a financial institution in the nearest city. She read through everything twice the way she had read the letter. The figure was not enormous. It would not reshape the world, but it was real, genuinely real, and it was considerably more than Mara had allowed herself to imagine, because she had learned not to imagine numbers that felt like grace. It was enough to repair the house properly, enough to get through a year, maybe 2, while she figured out the next step. Enough to mean that Wren would not go back to sleeping on a cot in a shelter. Mara sat on the cellar floor after reading the documents and looked at the shelves around her. She thought about Elsa at 30, at 40, at 50. Standing in the cellar with a jar in each hand, placing things carefully on shelves that were meant for a person she was not sure would ever come. Not sure, but certain enough to keep going. Not sure, but patient enough to do it for 20 years. The garden came first, not as a project or a plan. It began simply, almost accidentally, with Carl coming over one morning in the 2nd week, with seeds in his pockets and a tell under his arm, and Wren trailing behind him, asking questions about soil, and Mara finding herself on her knees in the turned, dark earth, before she had consciously decided to be there. March in the mountains was not yet planting season for most things, but there were cold-tolerant starts, Carl explained. Things that could go in the ground now and simply wait, patient as everything else on this hillside, for the warmth to arrive. Spinach, kale, a variety of lettuce Elsa had bred over many years toward cold hardness. Garlic, which had already been in the ground since fall, Elsa's own garlic, because Carl had planted it in November, exactly as she always had, not wanting the sequence to break. She said the garlic understood time better than people did. Carl told Wren, pressing a clove into the soil to show her the depth. Wren considered this seriously, because it's underground, partly because it knows to be patient. Mara worked beside them, and did not speak much. But she was thinking about Elsa at this age, her own age, 37, maybe 38, on her knees in this exact dirt. Planting things that would not be eaten by the person she was planting them for. Storing things on shelves that a person she was not sure would ever come would eventually open and read by lamplight. She was thinking about the kind of love that does not announce itself, the kind that simply continues, season after season, without confirmation that it will ever be received, the kind of love that is indistinguishable from work, and indistinguishable from patience, and indistinguishable from faith. Not religious faith necessarily, but the smaller and more stubborn kind, the kind that keeps putting garlic in the ground in November, because spring reliably follows winter, even when winter is very long. Elsa had not been a demonstrative woman. Mara remembered this clearly now, not as criticism, just as fact. She had not been the kind of grandmother who said the soft things easily. She had said them sometimes, but not easily and not often. She had more readily shown you how to seal a jar than told you she loved you. She had more readily pressed a seed packet into your hand than said the things that Mara at 19 had sometimes needed to hear. Mara had interpreted this at 19 as a kind of emotional withholding, as something she was not quite being given. She understood now that she had been reading the wrong language. The cellar was the sentence. The garden was the sentence. The binder with 46 pages of Carl's handwriting and Elsa's margin notes was the sentence. 20 years of patient accumulation, of preparing a place for someone who might need it, of trusting that the love would eventually find its recipient, even if the person doing the loving was no longer there to see it arrive. That was the language, not the soft words at the right moment. The long, quiet work in the right direction. Mara sat back on her heels and looked at the ridge where more snow had melted since they arrived, revealing longer stretches of dark slope and the dark skeletons of last year's growth already beginning to show the first tentative color at the tips. She thought about the last visit at 19. What she had been angry about. She still could not precisely remember. Something about feeling unmet, unsane, wanting acknowledgement that she wasn't getting, wanting language that Elsa didn't know how to give. She had left in the middle of an afternoon with whatever fury had felt justified at the time, and she had not come back. And Elsa had kept going, had kept putting things on shelves, kept preparing the cellar, kept tending the garden, had not required Mara's presence to continue the work, had simply kept going in the direction she had decided on, without asking for credit or confirmation. There was a grief in this that Mara had not expected and could not entirely manage. Not grief for Elsa's death, though that was there too. But grief for the 20 years between the last visit and now, for everything Elsa had been quietly doing in that space, and everything Mara had not known to see. But grief, she was learning at 37, was not the same thing as loss. Sometimes you grieve the distance between yourself and something that had still managed against all odds to reach you. Sometimes the love arrived on time after all. The garlic came up in April. It was Wren who noticed first green spears emerging from the dark soil in the early morning, small and definite, precisely where they had been placed in the fall by Carl. Guided by Elsa's instructions from a year before she died, Wren came and found Mara in the kitchen and said, "Come see." Mara stood at the garden's edge and looked at the green things pushing up from the cold earth, and she held her coffee in both hands, and she let herself simply be there for a moment, not managing anything, not calculating anything, not holding anything in carefully measured reserve. She thought about a woman she had misread for most of her adult life, who had spent 20 years speaking in the only language she knew, which was the language of preparation, of patient labor, of putting things carefully in the right place and trusting that eventually someone would come to find them. She thought about how love, in the end, is not always a feeling expressed in the right moment. Sometimes it is a decision made very early and kept faithfully across weather and silence and years of not knowing whether it will ever be received. Sometimes it is a root in the ground, all winter, invisible, doing its slow, necessary work in the dark. Sometimes it is a door that opens on the first try, 20 years after it was meant for you. Wren slipped her hand into Mara's, the way she sometimes did in the morning, before the day had fully claimed them both in that quiet interval when it was still just the two of them, and the world around them, and nothing required yet. "Can we plant more things today?" Wren asked. "Yes," Mara said. "Yes, we can plant more things." And she meant the seeds. She meant all of it. She thought of Elsa and she thought, "I understand now. I finally understand what you were saying, all those years. Not the things you said, the things you did, the cellar you built for no one, and for me, the garden you kept in case I needed it, the key you wore around your neck, as if losing it would mean losing the way to something you were saving. She thought, what kind of faith does it take to prepare a place for someone who may never come? What kind of love looks exactly like ordinary work, done quietly for decades without an audience? The green spears stood in the cold April light, patient and certain, and entirely indifferent to how long they had taken to arrive. And Mara stood beside her daughter in the garden her grandmother had kept for her, and finally quietly came home. How many things have been built for us in silence that we will only understand when we finally have the patience to